Well, hello, dear friend. Come sit with me a while. I can hear in the way you've settled into that chair that you might be a little under the weather today, or perhaps you're just here to listen, and that's perfectly fine too. Either way, I've got honey warming gently on the stove, mixed with just a touch of water, the way my mother always kept it ready during the months when sore throats seemed to visit our house more often than welcome guests ever did. I want to tell you today about honey and about throats and about the particular remedy that I believe was more trusted in our household than almost anything else my mother ever kept on her shelf. If you've ever had a sore throat, that raw, scratchy, swallowing feels like swallowing glass kind of discomfort, then you already understand why this remedy mattered so much to us, and why it's the one I find myself returning to even now, all these years later, whenever my own throat feels the slightest bit rough. Before I begin properly, I want to remind you, as I always do, that what I'm sharing with you today comes from memory, from family tradition, from a kitchen and a way of life that existed long before any of us thought to call a doctor for something as ordinary as a sore throat. I am not a doctor myself, and I never trained as one. If your throat trouble is severe, if it comes with a very high fever, if swallowing becomes truly difficult, or if it simply doesn't improve after several days, please go and see a doctor. That is simply good sense, the same good sense my mother carried with her every single day of her life, knowing precisely when her remedy box had done all it could do and when something more was needed. But for the ordinary sore throat, the kind that comes with a winter cold or from too much talking or from the dry air of a heated house in the coldest months, let me tell you what we did and why honey sat at the very center of it all. I think to understand why honey mattered so much in our house, you have to understand a little about where our honey came from, because it wasn't simply something bought at a store sitting in an identical jar year after year. My father kept several hives at the edge of our orchard, tucked back where the wind couldn't trouble them too badly. And tending those hives was one of his quieter joys, something he did with a careful, patient attention that I think mirrored, in its own way, the same patience my mother brought to her remedy box. Through the spring and summer, the bees would work the clover, the wildflowers, the blossoms on our fruit trees, and by late summer and into fall, my father would carefully harvest what they'd produced, leaving enough behind for the bees themselves to survive the winter on. The honey that came from this process changed character through the year in ways that fascinated me as a child. Early summer honey, gathered when the bees had been working mostly clover, came out light and delicate, almost golden white, with a mild, gentle sweetness. Honey gathered later in the season, after the bees had turned to whatever wildflowers and late blooms remained, came out darker, richer, almost amber brown, with a deeper, more complex flavor that carried a slight bitterness underneath all that sweetness. My mother was particular about which honey she used for which purpose, and though I never fully understood her reasoning as a child, I came to believe as I grew older that she trusted the darker, richer honey most for soothing a truly troubled throat, believing it carried more of whatever properties made honey such a powerful remedy in the first place. Now, the most basic version of this remedy, the one she turned to first at even the faintest hint of throat trouble, was simply a spoonful of honey taken plain, straight from the spoon, letting it coat the throat as it slid down slowly. She always insisted we take it slowly, never gulping it down quickly, because she believed the honey needed time to properly coat the irritated tissue, and gulping it down too fast wasted much of its soothing benefit. I remember sitting at the kitchen table as a child, spoon in hand, under her careful watch, taking my honey in small, deliberate movements while she nodded approvingly, as though I were performing some important ceremony rather than simply eating a spoonful of something sweet. For a sore throat that came alongside the early stages of a cold, she would often warm a cup of water. Not too hot, just warm enough to dissolve the honey properly without destroying whatever good it contained, because she held a firm belief that honey heated too aggressively lost some of its healing power. Into this warm water she'd stir a generous spoonful of honey, and if we happened to have a lemon on hand, which was a genuine treasure in the depths of winter, she'd squeeze in a good amount of fresh lemon juice as well, claiming the combination worked far better together than either ingredient could manage alone. The lemon, she believed, helped cut through the thick, sometimes mucus-laden discomfort in the throat, while the honey worked to soothe and coat whatever the lemon's sharpness might otherwise irritate. I remember the particular ritual of this remedy so clearly, how she'd hand the warm cup over with both her hands wrapped around it first, transferring some of that warmth before letting go, how she'd tell whoever was sick to sip it slowly, never gulping, and how she'd often sit with us while we drank it, talking softly about nothing in particular, the weather, the animals, a story from her own childhood, anything to keep us calm and distracted from the discomfort in our throats while the honey did its quiet work. For a throat that had moved beyond simple scratchiness into something more painful, more swollen and difficult to swallow past, my mother had a slightly different preparation that she reserved for these more stubborn cases. She would mix honey not just with warm water, but with a small amount of grated fresh ginger, steeped first in hot water to release its warming, spicy qualities, then combined with the honey once the water had cooled to a drinkable temperature. This ginger-honey mixture carried real heat to it, a kind of warming sensation that seemed to work its way down the throat and settle some of the worst of the swelling and discomfort, at least enough to make swallowing food and water more bearable through the worst of the illness. She also kept always a particular blend that combined honey with a small amount of apple cider vinegar, a remedy I confess I found less pleasant than the others as a child, given the sharp tang of the vinegar cutting against the sweetness of the honey. But she swore by this combination especially for throats that felt not just sore but somehow infected, carrying that particular hot, swollen feeling that suggested something more than ordinary irritation. She believed the vinegar's acidity helped fight off whatever was causing the trouble, while the honey once again worked to soothe and coat the tissue beneath. I remember holding my nose slightly as I drank this particular mixture, much to her gentle amusement, though I never dared refuse it outright, knowing how firmly she believed in its power. Alongside all of these honey-based drinks, my mother maintained an unwavering faith in the warm saltwater gargle, something I mentioned to you once before in an earlier visit, but which deserves its proper place here too, since the two remedies worked so closely together in her mind. She'd have us gargle with warm salt water several times throughout the day, particularly before bed and first thing in the morning, believing the salt helped reduce swelling and draw out some of the irritation directly, while the honey afterward provided the soothing coat that the salt water alone couldn't offer. The two remedies, salt water and honey, worked almost like a pair in our house, one to clean and reduce, the other to soothe and protect, used together rather than as alternatives to one another. I want to tell you about a particular memory I have, one that I think captures something important about how seriously my mother took this whole business of caring for a sore throat, beyond simply the remedies themselves. I must have been around 9 years old, and I'd come down with what was, even by the standards of our household, an unusually severe sore throat, one that made even swallowing my own saliva feel like a genuine ordeal. I remember crying, not just from the pain itself, but from a kind of frustrated misery at not being able to do much of anything, not eat properly, not talk without real discomfort, not even swallow without wincing. My mother sat beside my bed that evening, and rather than simply handing me the usual cup of warm honey water and moving on to her other tasks, she stayed. She held the cup for me, helping me sip slowly, and between sips she talked to me softly, telling me stories about her own childhood, about a particularly bad sore throat she remembered having when she was about my age, and how her own mother had cared for her through it in much the same way she was caring for me now. There was something in that moment, in the way she connected her care for me to the care she'd once received herself, that made the whole experience feel less like simple sickness and more like being woven into something larger, some long chain of mothers caring for children that stretched back further than I could properly imagine at 9 years old. I asked her, between sips of honey water, whether the remedy would really make my throat better, and she told me something I've carried with me ever since. She said that the honey would help, certainly, but that healing also took time and patience and the simple comfort of being cared for while the body did its own slow work. She said that sometimes we want remedies to work instantly, the way we might want rain to stop the moment we wish it to, but that most real healing, the lasting kind, happens gradually, quietly, often while we're simply resting and being looked after, rather than through any single dramatic cure. I think about that conversation often, especially now, given everything that's changed in the world since then, given how quickly so many people today expect relief to arrive, how readily available so many fast remedies have become. I don't say this as criticism, because I understand the genuine value in modern medicine's speed and effectiveness, particularly for serious illness where waiting simply isn't an option. But I do think there was something valuable in my mother's patience, in her willingness to sit with discomfort, to ease it gently rather than eliminate it instantly, and to use that slower process as an opportunity for connection and care, rather than simply as an inconvenience to be rushed through. I want to tell you too about how this honey remedy extended beyond just the person who was sick, because in our household, sore throats were rarely a private affair, given how many of us lived under one roof. When one child came down with a sore throat, my mother would often prepare honey water for the whole family as a kind of preventative measure, believing that taking it before symptoms fully set in might lessen whatever was coming, or perhaps stop it from spreading further through the house entirely. I'm not certain how much truth there was in this particular belief, but I remember the whole family gathered around the table some evenings, each of us with our own cup of warm honey water, drinking together almost as a kind of ritual, a shared act of care that bound us together, even as we worried about whatever illness might be moving through the house. There's a particular detail I want to share with you about how my mother stored and prepared her honey for these remedies, because I think it speaks to the careful attention she brought to everything she did. She kept a separate jar of honey, distinct from the honey used in everyday cooking and baking, reserved specifically for remedies. This particular jar held what she considered the very best honey from each year's harvest, the darkest, richest batch my father had brought in, and she guarded this jar carefully, never letting it run too low, always making certain we had enough set aside before the depths of winter arrived, when sore throats and colds were most likely to visit. There was something almost sacred in the way she treated that particular jar, setting it apart from ordinary use, reserving its contents specifically for moments of sickness and discomfort, as though the honey itself understood the difference between everyday sweetening and genuine healing work. I also want to mention, because I think it's worth knowing, that not every honey was considered equal in my mother's eyes, beyond simply the light and dark distinction I mentioned earlier. She held a particular reverence for what was sometimes called raw honey, meaning honey that hadn't been heated or processed in any significant way beyond simple straining to remove larger bits of wax and debris. She believed strongly that heating honey too much, the way some commercial processes did even in her time, destroyed much of whatever made it effective as a remedy. And so she was always careful, when preparing her honey water mixtures, to use water that was warm but never boiling, never hot enough to seriously cook the honey itself. I think, looking back now across all these years, that this particular remedy, honey in its various preparations, for a sore and troubled throat, represents something larger about how my mother approached healing in general. She trusted simple things, things that came directly from the natural world around us, things that required patience and careful preparation rather than quick fixes. She believed in the power of warmth, of gentle coating and soothing rather than aggressive treatment. And she believed, perhaps most importantly, that the act of caring for someone, of sitting with them and tending to their discomfort patiently, mattered every bit as much as whatever specific remedy she was offering. I hope in telling you all of this today that you've come away with more than simply a recipe for honey water, though I do hope you'll try it yourself the next time your own throat feels rough and scratchy. I hope you've come away, too, with a sense of the careful attention, the patience, and the deep well of love that sat behind every spoonful of honey my mother ever offered to a sick child in our house. There was nothing flashy or dramatic about this particular remedy, nothing that would have impressed anyone looking for quick, modern solutions, but it worked, slowly and steadily, the same way most genuine healing tends to work, and it carried with it something beyond the physical relief alone, a sense of being cared for, of being important enough to warrant careful attention, even for something as ordinary as a sore throat. I want to remind you, before I let you go today, just as I always do, that these are old remedies from a different time, things passed down through a family and a community that lived without the conveniences you have available to you now. If your sore throat feels truly severe, if it comes with high fever or real difficulty swallowing, or if it simply doesn't improve after several days of rest and care, please see a doctor. That is simply wisdom, every bit as important now as it was when my mother knew precisely when to trust her remedy box and when to seek further help. But for the ordinary sore throat, the kind that visits nearly everyone at some point through the colder months, I hope there's something here today that brings you comfort. A warm cup of honey water, perhaps, prepared slowly and taken in small, deliberate sips, the way my mother always insisted it should be done. I want to tell you, too, about a particular gathering I remember from my girlhood, a quilting bee held at a neighboring farm one autumn afternoon, where the conversation among the women turned, as it so often did, to remedies and home cures, and where I first heard honey discussed not simply as something my own mother trusted, but as a remedy with its own deep history, stretching back further than any of the women present could properly trace. One of the older women at that gathering, a grandmother herself many times over, told us that her own grandmother had used honey for sore throats, and that this grandmother's grandmother had done the same, passing the knowledge down through so many generations that no one present could say with certainty where it had first begun. I remember sitting quietly in the corner of that room, supposed to be minding my needlework, but listening intently instead, struck by the idea that this simple remedy I'd grown up with, this spoonful of honey my mother gave so casually whenever a throat felt rough, connected me to women I would never meet, living in times I could barely imagine, all of us bound together by this same quiet trust in something so simple and so sweet. That same afternoon, another woman mentioned a slight variation she preferred, mixing her honey not with plain water or lemon, but with a small amount of warm milk, claiming the combination created an even more soothing coating for the throat, particularly helpful for a cough that tended to keep a person awake through the night. I went home and mentioned this to my mother, half expecting her to dismiss it in favor of her own preferred methods. But instead she considered it carefully, tried it herself the very next time one of us came down with a nighttime cough, and found that she rather liked the result. From that point forward, warm milk and honey, sometimes with just a touch of nutmeg sprinkled on top, became a regular part of her remedy rotation, particularly for bedtime, when she wanted something that would soothe the throat while also helping to settle a restless child toward sleep. I think this willingness to adapt, to learn from other women in the community, and incorporate new variations into her own practice was itself an important part of how these remedies survived and evolved across generations. My mother never treated her remedy box as something fixed and unchangeable, handed down in stone from her own mother, and never to be altered. Instead, she held it as something living, something that could grow and change as she learned new combinations, heard of new variations, or simply discovered through her own trial and observation that one approach worked better than another for a particular person or a particular kind of throat trouble. I think there's something valuable in that openness, that willingness to keep learning, even within a tradition built on old, trusted ways. I want to mention, too, a particular detail about how my mother handled honey remedies differently depending on who in the family was suffering, because she held strong opinions about age and honey that I think are worth sharing here, particularly since they touch on something genuinely important. For the youngest babies in our household, those not yet a year old, she never gave honey at all, not in any form, no matter how minor the throat trouble seemed. She'd learned this caution from her own mother, who'd learned it from observations passed down through the family, long before anyone fully understood the reasons why very young infants needed to avoid honey altogether. For these youngest ones, she relied instead on other remedies entirely, the chamomile and gentle care I mentioned to you in an earlier conversation, saving the honey treatments for children old enough to safely receive them. For the older children and the adults in the house, however, honey remained the trusted centerpiece of nearly every throat remedy she prepared, and she was generous with it, never stingy or sparing when someone was genuinely suffering, even during years when honey itself was harder to come by due to a poor harvest from the hives or a particularly difficult winter for the bees themselves. I remember one year when my father's hives produced far less honey than usual, and my mother, faced with a smaller supply than she was accustomed to, simply became more careful and deliberate about how she used what we had, reserving it strictly for genuine need rather than everyday cooking, making certain that whoever was truly sick always had access to what they needed, even if it meant the rest of us went without honey in our morning porridge for much of that particular winter. I find myself thinking, as I tell you all of this, about the particular sound of my mother's kitchen during those long winter evenings when someone was nursing a sore throat. The quiet bubble of water warming on the stove, the soft clink of a spoon against a jar as she measured out the honey, the gentle creak of her chair as she settled in beside whoever needed her attention that evening. There was a rhythm to it, a kind of unhurried ceremony that unfolded the same way, evening after evening, throughout the worst weeks of every winter. And I think that rhythm itself became part of the remedy, part of what made us feel cared for and safe, even while we were genuinely uncomfortable and unwell. I hope in sharing all of these additional memories and details with you today that you've gained an even fuller picture of just how central this simple, humble remedy was to our entire way of life, and how much careful thought, tradition, and love went into something that might seem, on the surface, like nothing more than a spoonful of honey in warm water. It was never really just that, not in our house, and I suspect it was never really just that in any of the households throughout our community who practiced these same old traditions, generation after generation, mother after mother, each one adding her own small variations while holding fast to the same essential truth, that honey, given with patience and genuine care, could ease a great deal of suffering, and that the act of giving it carefully, slowly, and with full attention mattered every bit as much as the honey itself. Thank you truly for sitting with me today, for letting an old woman tell you about honey jars and warm kitchens, and a mother who never once seemed to tire of soothing a sore throat with nothing more than patience and a spoonful of something sweet. There's so much more I could tell you, and I do hope you'll find your way back to visit again soon. Take care of your throat and take care of yourselves.